Welcome to the Big Brain Stream. Last week, if you remember, we talked about power and the dynamics of power and how power is distributed and where it comes from and how it's used. Today's stream is actually about, power, but utilized, right, in an organized way. Today, we will be talking about nations, states, and the role of government. It's a very nuanced topic, and we will be throwing around some words that I'm sure you've heard before, but hopefully talking about them in a way that maybe you haven't really appreciated them before. And I apologize that my words are going to get all minced throughout this stream because my brain is all foggy due to reasons. So I have my tea here. That's for the ASMR folks out there. However, we are going to continue playing Civ. I played for a little bit after the stream last week, and so we have advanced a little bit further. I believe we are now in the classical era. As you can see, our town has sort of renovated itself a little bit. We are continuing through our civilization campaign, trying to make a better nation state. And I guess there really is no better place to start than what is a nation state, right? So, nation state, government, words, what do they mean? The thing is that there is actually a fairly nuanced difference between a nation, a state, and a government, okay? And I say nuanced because it is kind of subtle differences. They are all related to each other. I'll do some of the water, and I'll do some of the tea. The spiffing Brit would approve. Anyways, nation, state, government, they're all words that sort of describe around the same thing, okay? But what we are going to be talking about is, first of all, starting with what is a state, okay? So some of you may have heard me talk about the state before, all right? And generally speaking, when I reference the state, I don't mean a state in the American sense where we have the federal government and the 50 states, right? When I say state, I don't mean the states. I mean the state. And the state is essentially this organized body through which we have decided to govern ourselves. America is a state, right? Canada is a state. Peru is a state. They're individual geographic areas that have sole propriety over their geographical area. Generally, in order for something to be a state, there needs to be three things present. And as I go through those three things, we are going to start, and we're just going to go right into the next turn. A state has three characteristics, all right?
From the height of these pyramids,
I forgot, I set these to build a while ago. Build pyramids, right? Yeah. Anyways, isn't the state the power to enforce the laws in a territory too? Actually, Lushido, that is right on the money. That is one of the characteristics. It is compulsory, right? If you have a state, people who are governed by that state need to listen to it or suffer some sort of consequence, right? In more civilized nations, it's usually, they broke a law, they're charged with the crime, they go through a trial, and then they're punished in one way or another. In less civilized nations, they could just be flat out killed. So it is compulsory in the sense that if you are governed by that state, it needs laws. Exactly. Laws are one factor within compulsory. It's also the ability to compel, right? So it needs to be backed up by some sort of force, generally. The second characteristic, it needs to have a monopoly over resources within its geographical borders. So if you look at our borders, right, generally speaking, right, so if we go into within our territory, we are considered in civilization and in real life would be considered a state currently, right, the state of Greece. And it's the same reason that these places are called city-states within the game. Because we're going to back out of there, right, Lisbon, right, Carthage down here, Athens, which is also connected with Corinth. We have Kandy, and then there's also Brazil, which is starting to connect its territories. Generally speaking, we have a monopoly over all of the resources within this land, right? Our state, is the only power in that area that is entitled to harvest the resources therein. Right, whether it is mining, developing quartz in a quarry, harvesting the fields for wheat, and then putting those resources towards production of goods in order to help the state be prosperous. Right, and then the same thing is with Lisbon. Right, they have a border here, and whatever resources are within their border, like they have some iron, they have some whales. Carthage has some wildlife, some deer, and they have some, looks like some cocoa here. Or no, is the cocoa just outside? I'm not sure. Whatever. They have a monopoly over this. If anybody tries to steal those resources from them, they can compel the person to return those resources. So you have, it's compulsory, they have a monopoly over resources, and then the last characteristic is that the state is legitimate. Now, what does that mean? Legitimate characteristic is the fact that we have a legitimate claim over this area, right? We established, and so for purposes of the game and generally in real life, the legitimate claim comes from the fact that they settled there first, right? It's basically ownership through conquering, or ownership by just having it long enough that you can't look back and say, has anybody ever owned it before? That is the legitimacy of the ownership claim within this geographic area. And over time, they start to legitimately expand because all of this land is unclaimed. Same with Corinth. Corinth is starting to expand. Now, the problem becomes is, okay, what if our border butts up against Candy and we decide that we want to take this? Well, the idea with legitimacy is, and the monopoly, is that we wouldn't just be able to take over their thing, especially if we see Candy as a legitimate nation state. Because if we did, we would likely have to fight them for it. Because again, they can compel people within their borders to give the resources back because they have a monopoly over it. Well, if we go into their lands and try to take their resources, they're going to try to compel us to give it back, which between two states, that's called a war, right? So that, in a nutshell, is essentially what a state is. We are going to continue working on... do that because we don't have any iron mines set up yet, but we will soon, so that we can harvest the resources within our boundaries. The builder, what does he need to build? Where can he build? Yes, we need to build a quarry. We need to farm that rice. That's what we need to do. Give me that rice, farm those resources. Anyways, back to the lecture. Now that we've managed our affairs for the time being and taken some tea. Generally within a state, right? The state is also sometimes paralleled with government. And generally speaking, government is simply the regime that is in power, okay? But a state has, as part of its kind of organization, right? There were the three characteristics, but then there are generally, it's a collection of agencies and, yes, you are going to build a farm. It's a collective of agencies and institutions that help govern. Those agencies generally, it is the administrations and bureaucracies that make up the government, right? The democratic institutions or potentially the monarchical institutions. It generally has a military and a police force to help enforce that monopoly, right? To make their laws compulsory. There is generally a judiciary as well, so that it can arbitrate disputes between not only its citizens, but also between territories within that state. Basically, I've just described the executive, legislative, and judicial branch of the U.S. government. But you also have subcentral agencies. These could be like localities, right? Municipalities. And then you can have other legislative bodies. In the U.S., we have what are called administrative agencies, agencies that work within the executive branch that are given power by the legislative branch. And it can be any number of those things that a state can have within its organization. But generally speaking, when we talk about just the government is just the administration and power. We need to establish a new trade route, and this trader is going to... Carthage, 4 gold, love that money. But we're going to go 3 gold and some science. So, what is a nation? All right, we have to differentiate between a nation and a state. when it comes to a nation is more of a sense of belonging, a sense of shared culture, ethnicity. It can sometimes just be a shared experience in order to make a people into a nation. All right. And when one practices pride in that culture, ethnicity, it is called nationalism. Okay. And you can have a nation without a state. There are communities. Look at the nation of Palestine, right? That you have an entire group of people who consider themselves one people, one culture, one ethnicity, but do not have a state to call their own. Now, they have tried to set up kind of this government without a state, a stateless government, if you will, or a government in exile. However, it isn't technically a state in unto itself, because, I mean, Israel, the state that encompasses Palestine, basically says that you don't exist. You can see this all over the world. You can see it with Tibet and China. You can see it with the Uyghur people in China. You could name like 3 examples in China. There's a group that's fighting in Syria against primarily ISIS, right? Now, ISIS is a really good example of a group that is arguably a nation in and of itself, but is not a state, even though it tried to be a state. But it tried to do it illegitimately, and thus it didn't really work. It failed to meet that 3rd characteristic because it did it by trying to overtake lands and saying, these are ours now. Well, it doesn't work like that, ISIS. You have to be recognized by essentially other states in order to be a legitimate state. With nations, it is this sense of culture, this sense of community. But it is generally seen being practiced as a civil religion of sorts, right? Where you have these symbols or people being held up as essentially kind of like deities, or they are deified in the nation's eye. But you have to differentiate then nationalism from patriotism, because patriotism isn't nationalism. They do come sometimes in the Venn diagram of nationalism and patriotism. There are some shared characteristics, but for the most part, patriotism is the desire or the will or the drive to serve and fight and preserve a state. A nation, or nationalism, is that sense of culture and sense of identity and sense of pride with regards to the community that you're in, that is not necessarily attached to a state, but can be. And when it is, that's when it becomes a nation state. And that is basically when you have that shared sense of identity, of culture, of ethnicity, of ideology, and it is combined with the formation, organized nature of a state. That's when you have a nation state. Now, when you do have a nation state, you do need to have it organized somewhat. You need to have some sort of organized form of government. There are different forms of government. And it's not just democracy. Ooh, you'll find us engineers and architects will be happy in a place where they can grow. Brazil, for instance, he wants our scientists. A weird veiled threat. I think we better start building an army. Oh boy, Brazil is after us. Anywho, when it comes to governments, you break it down this way, right? It's kind of like a branching tree thing. Generally speaking, the first split is democratic or non-democratic form. We can go down the democratic branch first, and then we'll go down the undemocratic branch. So generally speaking, a democracy, first of all, is a form of government in which the people have a say. That's basically it. If the people have a say in what their government or what their state, protects, so how their state affairs are managed, what resources are used, and what those resources are used for, then you have a democracy. If, however, the people do not have a say, then you have a non-democratic form. The thing with democracy, though, is how do the people have a say? What is the form of that say? And there are generally 3 forms of democracy. The first, being the easiest and most simple, would be a direct democracy. All right. And a direct democracy basically means that every person in the country or in the state has a say in every decision that is made by the government within that state. Obviously, that wouldn't work in any extremely large population, right? Ooh, iron marking. When it comes to need that tea. Direct democracies. Generally, it works better in smaller populations because every person gets a say on everything that's made. Usually, municipalities can pull off a direct democracy very, very well. And when we Americans first came to this vast, open, wide space that was already populated by Native Americans, and we said this is ours now. Just seems to be a common theme in history. And this boat needs orders, and we're going to have him go and explore. So, the next step is a representative democracy. When you have too many people where it would become feasible for everyone to have a vote in everything. You move on to a direct or a representative democracy where essentially what you do is the way that the U.S. government is set up, or the way that, British Parliament is set up, or the way that, any number of democratic institutions in the world are set up currently. The people choose a representative, someone to speak for them within the bureaucratic structure of the government. That person then will, based upon, who their supporters are, will carry that voice, that collective voice, to the halls of governance, and then enact and decide on behalf of the people that they represent. Representative democracy. That is the U.S. That is multiple democratic institutions within the world. We probably should build cities. And then there is a liberal democracy. A liberal democracy is basically a democracy in which certain rights are also guaranteed to the people. But the Enlightenment, the Enlightenment is good. The Enlightenment is good. What do you do? I didn't read. What do you do? Gilgamesh. I am Gilgamesh of Sumeria and king of Uruk. Do not be afraid. I am good to my friends. I'd love to sample that hospitality. Give me that hospitality there, Gilgamesh. A liberal democracy is basically a democracy in which, again, the people have a say, but also they are guaranteed certain liberties, certain civil rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right? Right to bear arms. So the U.S. is also a liberal democracy. Now, some of you may be sitting in the chat and thinking, wait a second, America's a republic. Isn't that a democracy? We're a representative republic. Well, I would say yes, you are correct. Technically.
You are technically correct. The best kind of correct.
A republic is essentially a representative liberal democracy. A republic is essentially a democracy that is representative in nature, but also guarantees certain rights to its people. That's essentially what it is. Now, you can go online and you can find 1,000 definitions of what a republic and how I'm wrong. But I'm telling you, they're all wrong. A republic, there's various definitions of it, but generally speaking, and the best definition I've found is that it's essentially a liberal representative democracy. It's not a new thing. It is a democracy. It's just a form of democracy. And those are the three general forms of democracy. And there can be shades in between. Again, right? You can have a liberal direct democracy, right? I don't know what that would be called, right? So, non-democratic forms of government. What do we have? You have generally two categories. You have totalitarian regimes and authoritarian regimes. What is the difference between them? You are just going to wait. You are going to continue. Ooh, I can actually... Authoritarianism and totalitarianism, being undemocratic forms of government, the one thing that they share is that the people do not have a say. They can fake democracy. Okay, they can do what is known as a false democracy, where they appear to have democratic institutions such as voting and representatives, but really it's all like a show that's put on for the people to keep the masses quelled. Because in an authoritarian or totalitarian regime, there is one person or group that is in charge, and they make all the decisions about everything that happens within the state. So what is the nuanced difference between totalitarianism and authoritarianism? Totalitarianism is authoritarianism light. Okay, there's full-bodied, full diesel authoritarianism, and then there's authoritarianism light, which is totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is essentially that there is 3 components. I'm going to read them to you from the book. So it's important. Zoom in. A comprehensive ideology detailing all aspects of social life, with those opposed exterminated as enemies of the state. A centrally controlled state bureaucracy that promotes this ideology via complete control of the communication and information infrastructure, and a terror system for identifying and eliminating state enemies. And a state-controlled political party that involves mass participation, whether willing or forced. Other scholars include components such as a sole political party with one leader and a focus on militarist expansion. The best example I can give? Russia. Russia is arguably a totalitarian state. Some people would disagree with me. Some people say, well, no, there's democracy there. But look at what was happening with the most recent guy who was poisoned by agents, by government agents, because he was a dissident. He was opposed to Putin and was actively running against him in what were supposed to be legitimate elections. You are going to activate. Give me that monies. So totalitarianism is this idea that you have this one state and they oppress and they say, you know, you're going to do what we say, and there's going to be no dissent, whatever. And then there's authoritarianism. And authoritarianism takes it a step further in the sense that not only do they need to dominate, but also you need to drink the Kool-Aid. Authoritarianism is totalitarianism, all of those same aspects, but you need to drink the Kool-Aid. You need to buy in, and you need believe that, hey, we've reached the medieval era. That's awesome. You need to believe that like your leader is a god king or a god emperor, right? There are no voluntary civic organizations, right? There are no interest groups. There are no clubs. There are no religions except for the ones that are dictated by the state. And you are going to go here and do this. I can't. Ah, yes. I'm going to attack. Right? He's just going to boo, 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 boo. Now, of course, I am fighting against a barbarian horde because they are not a legitimate state. They are a barbarian horde, right? Now, of course, they are not a legitimate state in my eyes. Maybe they do consider themselves a legitimate state. Maybe they do have some sort of national identity, but, you know, because I am bigger and stronger, I am exerting my power over them. Oh, these guys can hit me from far. Yeah. But it's a boat. Arrows on a boat. Wow, they did a ton of damage. Oh, boy. We are getting out of here. An example of an authoritarian state would be North Korea. North Korea is absolutely an authoritarian state. China is arguably an authoritarian state. No, I don't want to get closer to them. I want to go away from them so I can heal. So the authoritarian nature, right? There are some, even within the U.S., there are some political leaders who have some authoritarian tendencies, right? And authoritarian is just the idea that you need to love me, right? If you don't love me, you are a treasonous pig. Sound familiar? That's the last thing we'll talk about, because we got 10 minutes left, I can see. About 10-15, is we're going to use those kind of theoretical frameworks of power that we talked about last week and use them to kind of talk about, well, okay, so there's all these different forms of government, and there's the nation and the state, and if you have a nation, state, and a government, well, how should that government function? Who should that government serve, right? What should they put their resources towards, and who decides where those resources go? That's where you use the dynamics of power. And again, if you remember, we have the pluralist system, we have the elite managerial system, and we have the class system. Well, the U.S. is based, or at least the unofficial ideology of the U.S. Unofficial ideology of the United States is pluralism. It is the idea that we have multiple interest groups that all play a role in, you know, changing hands and trading power. One of the things that the U.S. prides itself on is what they call the civil transfer of power. It is the idea that somebody is chosen by the people and they're just elected. They take power, and the person who was in power hands it over, and the person who was newly elected walks in. Pluralism states it's that power is held by various interest groups and institutions throughout the nation and throughout the state. And those interest groups, some are sometimes more powerful and sometimes they're weaker, and thus power can change hands fairly frequently. When you have a pluralist society, it is guaranteed that at some point the people who are in power are no longer going to be in power at some point. And that is just generally accepted within democratic institutions. Now, pluralism, of course, there are criticisms of that. Because the idea of the pluralist society is that the power that then takes the institution or agency or whatever that has the most amount of power, then takes control of the government, will then enact policy and agenda that benefits its interests, right? It's the interests of the people that put them there. But the criticism is that sometimes you see that doesn't happen. The institutions are used by the elite to basically trade power between each other, and they just use the institutions of power to keep themselves in power and to benefit themselves, and that's where you're moving into elite managerial and class theory. And elite managerial basically says it's the elites who control the government. It's the elites who are the only ones that can run for office. And it's the elites who use the government to benefit themselves and keep themselves in power, because that is the most important. And why do they do this? Because they can. Because the masses don't have power. They don't have enough to stop us from doing it, right? Because we can control them through all of the skills and guile and wit that we have developed over the years. And you, sir, can we just heal up? No, you can't. You cannot heal outside friendly territory. Then we're just going to run. Run. We're going to get them going this way. So, elite managerial theory, though, talks about the elites taking control and keeping control, and that is the prime directive. But class theory refutes that. It says, well, wait, no, the masses do have power. And again, they have an economic form of power. And if they wanted to, they can seize the means of production. But the class-based theory also says that it's the ones who are in power are those that currently own the means of production. And thus, what their form of government benefits is production. It's companies, it's corporations. So you have, as opposed to in the elite managerial, the idea is you use power to keep power, and that's basically the only thing. The laws and policies and whatever you use the resources for is basically just so that you can stay in power. The class theory says, no, you use the power to benefit yourself financially. Some would say that that's kind of what the U.S. is in certain instances, is that the corporations. And stick around for a future stream, and we're going to talk about corporate welfare and how much they actually do benefit from those in power. The elite managerial and the class-based, they kind of look similar, but it's their purpose of utilizing resources. Ooh, this guy's going to die. He's totally going to die. Yeah, see if you can run. Can you run? Can you run? Can you run? There we go. He didn't want to listen to me. Yeah, he's going to die. No! My boat! So we're setting up kind of like a defensive line here, because I think Brazil's working on attacking us. They're building up an army. Do another trader, I think. Because money is always good. Money is the best. When it comes to power dynamics and how they are enforced, pluralism, again, that's the ideal. That's the ideology. Power changes hands. And therefore, everybody at some point will get their kind of day to use the institutions of power within a state to benefit themselves. Elite managerial says no. The people, the elites, the ones who are rich and have had power for eons will continue to have power because they use the institutions of government and the state to keep themselves in power. And class says no. It's the corporations and the heads of corporations, because they have the money, they have the economic power. And they use that power to continue to benefit themselves, which, in effect, keeps them in power. And all of this facade about democracy is actually false. And there is something to be said for that. As opposed to there being this, in pluralism, the conflict comes between interest groups. Elite managerial, it is between the rich and the masses. And class, it is between the workers and the corporate owners. In only one of those are people placed on sort of an even ground. Whereas in elite managerial and class, the two people fighting don't even necessarily always realize they're fighting, because one of the common tactics of the either, whether you're talking elite managerial or class, one of the common tactics is to direct the ire and direct the frustration of, whether it's the proletariat or whether it's the masses, depending upon which theory you're following, is to direct their attention as from going up to going outward, to going towards each other, and to convince them that they are in a pluralist system, and where race and religion is actually more important to argue about, rather than where the money is going and who is benefiting from government. Can I say that America is purely pluralist? No. But can I say that they're purely class or purely elite managerial? No. And this is now my personal kind of opinion, but I would like to think that I'm somewhat educated on the subject, and I think that there, depending upon where you look, you're going to see parts of all three. And at different times, and at different eras, and all of that, depending upon who's in power currently, and, you know, whatever the current government is. So, but that is going to be it for this week's lecture. If you did enjoy this, I am FPSkra. I am a lawyer and professor, and I do this for my job, but I also do it because I enjoy it, and I enjoy interacting with those that are willing to listen to me and who are willing to better themselves and who are willing to learn. So please, if you enjoyed this, follow, subscribe, like, whatever the button is that indicates please do more of this, because if I can start doing this more and, you know, the stuff starts happening, we could do better things. There's the YouTube's page. Please subscribe to that. Edited versions of this video will go up a week after the stream. But be back here Monday next week. I will be back here next week, Monday at 10 on twitch.tv/FPSkra. And other than that, please have a good week. I will see you next time.